going to say some things that I'm not sure if you're going to agree with me about today. I'm a little nervous. May we have a conversation that is ongoing, that continues to lift each of us in our world towards joy and justice. So, a short history of policing. Forgive me if this is all old news to you, and with gratitude to Carrie McDonald, the Executive Vice President of the UUA, a young, my age, biracial man who's also a seventh-generation Unitarian Universalist. He's been sharing on Facebook a history of policing in America using quotes from a textbook on law enforcement. It's called The Police in America, an Introduction, by Samuel Walker and Charles Katz. It's the kind of textbook you might be assigned if you were training to become a police officer, taking a course on law enforcement. So Kerry shared what he called some quotes from this far left radical source known as a policing textbook. The history of modern policing begins in the early 1800s. Walker and Katz begin with the slave patrol. They write, "The slave patrol was a distinctly American form of law enforcement, intended to guard against slave revolts and capture runaway slaves. In some respects, the slave patrols were actually the first modern police forces in this country." The Charleston, South Carolina Slave Patrol had about 100 officers in 1837 and was far larger than any northern city police force at the time. And a few decades later, police forces were organized to protect corporations as industrial workers began organizing. This is what the Pennsylvania State Police's website describes as its origin story. Their own website. To provide themselves protection that the Commonwealth did not provide, the coal and steel operators persuaded the state legislature to authorize the creation of what became the infamous coal and iron police. For $1 each, the state sold commissions to the mine and steel mill owners that conferred police power upon whomever the owners selected. Through these commissions, armies of guards were raised ostensibly to protect private property. In practice, they were used to enforce the will of the owners. In many cases, common gunmen, hoodlums, and adventurers were hired to fill these commissions, and they served their own interests by causing the violence and terror that gave them office. They served their own interests by causing the violence and terror that gave them office. End quote. As the forces became institutionalized, so did a culture of police officers banding together against the rest of the world. And I do believe in the inherent goodness of every person. And I don't want to in any way indict the beauty of any human life, including all those who serve as police officers. And instead, I'm talking about the institutions, the cultures and systems that get created. So I'm not going to emphasize that much, but I did feel important to say. So the textbook reads that in that early in the 20th century, reform increased the military ethos of police departments. The command system became far more authoritarian than it had been in the old days, an attempt to reform some of those hoodlums and adventurers. The rank and file police officer became the forgotten person, not respected by reformers who placed high hopes in strong administrators. As a result, they write, the rank and file retreated into an isolated and alienated police subculture that opposed most reforms. A subculture of the rank and file police officers that opposed reforms. This is a legacy that's continued decade upon decade. The early 1900s saw the first round of police groups attempting to systematically avoid accountability. You might have heard of the Boston police strike of 1919. Massachusetts governor and then President Calvin Coolidge activated then the state militia, noting that police as public servants needed to put the public interest first, and fired all the strikers. The violence in Boston produced a national backlash against police unions, and police unions in other cities disappeared. Police unionism was dead until the 1960s. But they write, the problem of an alienated rank and file remained. Also in that moment in the early 1900s, 1919, a wave of race riots swept the country. In Chicago's infamous events, tensions between the white ethnic communities of the city and the growing black residents arriving through the Great Migration from the South erupted in days of violence that decimated the black community. Walker and Katz write, investigations of these riots found race discrimination by the police prior to and during the riots. In some cases, officers joined in the rioting themselves. The Chicago Riot Commission recommended several steps to improve police-community relations, but the textbook states virtually nothing was done to either hire more African-American officers or eliminate race discrimination in police work. The history goes on. I know many of you lived through and even led efforts to change, to reform in the 1960s and 70s. The history of national and local law enforcement's role in the civil rights struggle is well and tragically documented. And here are the conclusions, a couple of the conclusions that these textbook authors make. There was never a golden age of policing where the police were friendly, knowledgeable about their neighbors, and enjoyed good relations with the public. Reports indicate that many officers drank on duty and frequently used excessive force. The NYPD was largely Irish Catholic, and officers were often hostile to or even brutal toward the new Italian and Jewish immigrants. In short, long before the introduction of the police car in the 20th century, American urban policing was highly impersonal and marked by police-citizen conflict. The idea, they say, the idea of the friendly neighborhood cop is pure myth. In the end, they write, while modern police were created to deal with the problems of crime and disorder, they mainly succeeded in becoming a social and political problem themselves. The rampant corruption and inefficiency set in motion generations of reform efforts that continue today. And sadly, reform efforts, we have to conclude, that have failed more often than not. Reforms that have led to police forces 2 centuries later that continue to murder black men, among others, at alarming rates. And so Carrie, our young leader among us, Kerry McDonald, ended his first post of this history lesson by asking, if any other public institution had a history like this, would you consider it salvageable? In the time of those early slave police patrols, there was a radical preacher named Theodore Parker who led a Unitarian church in Boston. He was a leading abolitionist, a white ally who knew the stakes and kept a gun in his pulpit to defend black members of his congregation against those who might attempt to capture them in service of the fugitive slave law. We celebrate him now as a revered ancestor, but his colleagues at the time, the Unitarian ministers of the nearby congregation, they ousted him from their midst, deeming his positions too radical to be associated with their idea of Unitarianism. And perhaps most famously, he is the original source of Martin Luther King Jr.'s declaration about the arc of the moral universe. And that quote has been on my mind. It's a profound quote, but it is sometimes misused, sometimes used to suggest a complacent acceptance of the efforts of gradual reform. A complacent acceptance that things will inevitably get better. And the intent could not have been more different. In 1852, when Parker preached the sermon in which he wrote those famous words, he and his people, they were actually living through a terrible cholera epidemic. And amidst that hardship, he was continuing to fight to abolish an institution that must have seemed as incontrovertible and necessary. Fighting to abolish slavery, an institution which must have seemed as incontrovertible and necessary as police and prisons seem to us. Fighting for morality in a world that seemed to have the odds stacked against us, but also in which a moment of chaos seemed like perhaps it could maybe, just maybe, give way to greater justice. And so he wrote, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice." From what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. This is why we gather, why we form religious community, why we have annual meetings and weekly worship, not simply to make a comfortable place for ourselves to gather with friends and raise our children, but to bind ourselves in common life-giving struggle. Because while none of us can calculate the curve and complete the figure, together we divine it by conscience. Together we feel our place in a tradition spanning across centuries, a moral vision, handed down generation by generation, shaped and reshaped in service of wholeness for our own lives and for our world. For the two cannot be separated. My humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. I want to share a poem, because you know I like to do that. This is a poem by Alice Walker. Been listening, and I hope you might as well, listening to the voices of Black leaders who you admire. Gather, she wrote in 2014, but could have written last week. It's still hard to believe that millions of us saw Eric Garner die. He died with what looked like a half-dozen heavily clad policemen standing on his body, twisting and crushing him, especially his head and neck. He was a big man, too. They must have felt like clumsy midgets as they dragged him down. Watching the video, I was reminded of the first lynching I quite unintentionally learned about. It happened in my tiny lumber mill town before the cows were brought in and young white girls or ornate floats became dairy queens. A big man, too, whom my parents knew. He was attacked also by a mob of white men in white robes and hoods and battered to death by their 2x4s. I must have been a toddler overhearing my parents talk and mystified by pieces of something called 2x4s. Later, building a house, I would encounter the weight, the heaviness of this varying length of wood and begin to understand. What is the hatred of the big black man? Or the small black man, or the medium-sized black man, the brown man, or the red man, in all his sizes, that drives the white lynch mob mentality? I always thought it was envy of the sheer courage to survive and ceaselessly resist conformity, enough to sing and dance or orate or say in so many outlandish ways, "You're not the boss of me." Think how many black men said that. "Cracker, you're not the boss of me," even enslaved. Think of how the legal lynch mob so long ago tore Nat Turner's body in quarters and skinned him and made money purses from his hide. Who are these beings? Now we are beginning to ask the crucial question. If it is natural to be black or red or brown, and if it is beautiful to resist oppression, and if it is gorgeous to be of color and walking around free, then where does the problem lie? Who are these people that kill our children in the night, murder our brothers in broad daylight, refuse to see themselves in us as we have strained over centuries to see ourselves in them? Perhaps we are more different than we thought. And does this scare us? And what, for instance, of those among us who collude? Gather. Gather, come see what stillness lies now in the people's broken hearts. Come see what stillness lies now in the people's broken hearts. It is the quiet force of comprehension, of realization of the meaning of our ancient and perfect contrariness, of what must now be understood and done to honor and cherish ourselves, no matter who today's bosses may be. Our passion and love for ourselves that must at last unite and free us as we put our sacrificed beloveds to rest in our profound and ample caring, broad, ever moving, and holy as the sea. Our passion and love for ourselves that must at last unite and free us. She offers Alice Walker a footnote to that poem, an explanation of the use of her epithet, cracker, an etymology that reveals a history not of petty retaliation, hate speech for hate speech, but one of more naming of the evil of white supremacy, one more language of rebellion. Cracker, she writes, from the crack of the whip wielded by slave drivers. Cracker, you're not the boss of me. And so it is past time for us to join our voices with those calling for a fundamental transformation of our society, to end institutionalized white supremacy and heal the soul of America. American slavery was an immoral institution, and people, some of them our own spiritual ancestors, bent the arc of the universe and abolished it. Our systems of policing and imprisonment are immoral institutions. And the time has come to bend the arc of the universe and abolish them. The time has past come to invest instead in efforts to repair the economic harms of slavery and white supremacy in all its forms that continue to ripple generation by generation. It's time for Unitarian Universalists to join our voices and call to defund police and prisons and fund instead reparations. It's time for us to heed the call of Black and brown leaders, voices like activist Paul Austin speaking at the demonstration this week in Marin City, sharing his righteous outrage over the history of Marin City's marginalization in this county, intoning again and again, it's been too long that Marin County has had its knee on Marin City's neck. I imagine that these will feel like extreme ideas to some of you, and others are likely impatient that we haven't taken bolder action yet. If all this feels out of left field to you, now I think is the time to get reading. Get reading, get watching, get listening. Leaders of color are sharing their visions for how we can move to a more just society. I'll be sharing articles and videos regularly in the weekly newsletter if you need a place to start. If you haven't read already Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which many of us read as a UUA common read a few years ago, that's a good place to start thinking about the need for prison abolition. You might read Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. I've just added for my summer reading list, and I hope you might read it with me. It's called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And then we can have some conversation about it in August or September. Small steps. Everything can feel like such a tiny step when the challenge we face is so enormous. Our faith in bending the arc calls us to act anyway, to put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Linda Howman has been leading our efforts, building relationships to harness power for change in our community. She'll share more of those steps, those small, those big, those necessary steps we can take as individuals and as a congregation at our annual meeting. Only 2% of calls to the police involve violent crime. Can we not imagine a more sensible solution to the other 98% of calls? Could we not fund training and deploying battalions of social workers and counselors, of community advocates, of housing and employment specialists? These are complicated issues. I'm not suggesting we already have the answers by any means, and I don't pretend to understand the moral universe. But the call to bend the arc is ringing clearly in the streets across our country. The call of conscience is clear. Will we hear it? One more reading to close by the young Black leader, Adrienne Marie Brown, written this week for George Floyd, Fire. Have you learned nothing from sunsets? Flaming the entire sky with soft edges, fuchsia, periwinkle wisps, taut and temporary nature taking day, inhaling night, inhaling light. Have you learned nothing from autumn blazing the earth with gorgeous death, burnt orange, kiss red fragility, reaching last chance for the sky, floating, releasing, exhaling life? Have you learned nothing from war, inferno, dappled muddy hose water, puddled green-edged flames of files, photos, losses, our battleground wherever you make us defend life? Have you learned nothing of justice? The deep, ever-changing heart must breathe. The fire in our veins needs oxygen. Do not unleash us if you don't want to burn. We'll keep choosing life. Have you learned nothing of love? You on your knees, but we the ones praying. Let us never give up on each other. Even when grief is the only match for the pyre, we honor life. It is the end of a day, a season, a way, an era. The change is tumult, terrifying, and beautiful. We will never be convinced to be expendable. Alchemize every death system. Liberate our divine lives. It is the end of a day, a season, a way, an era. The change is tumult, terrifying, and beautiful. We will never be convinced to be expendable. Alchemize every death system. Liberate our divine lives. May it be so. And amen.